For decades, Africa has witnessed a painful pattern. Leaders who attempted to break free from foreign influence, reclaim control over national resources, or chart an independent path often faced overwhelming resistance. Some were removed through coups, others were isolated politically. A few paid the ultimate price with their lives. Names such as Patrice Lumumba, Kwame Nkrumah, Thomas Sankara, and Muammar Gaddafi remain powerful reminders that challenging established geopolitical interests has rarely been without consequences. Today, many supporters of Captain Ibrahim Traore believe Burkina Faso is facing a similar test. Since taking power in September 2022, Traoré has become one of the most discussed leaders on the African continent. Supporters praise him as a defender of sovereignty and self-determination. Critics question his methods and his vision for the country's future. Yet, despite numerous reported coup plots, alleged assassination attempts, and constant security threats, he remains firmly in power. This raises an important question. Why do strategies that appeared effective against previous generations of African leaders seem unable to produce the same outcome in Burkina Faso today? In this video, we will examine the historical patterns that shaped Africa's political landscape and explore why Ibrahim Traoré may represent something different. Is he simply another leader facing extraordinary pressure? Or does he embody a new political reality that has changed the rules of the game? If you enjoy deep geopolitical analysis and untold stories shaping Africa's future, make sure to subscribe and join us for this fascinating journey. To understand the present, we must first understand the past. Throughout modern African history, leaders who pursued genuine political and economic independence often encountered a remarkably similar sequence of events. First came media pressure and international criticism. Then came internal divisions, often within political or military institutions. Economic instability or security crises frequently followed. Finally, the leader would be removed, overthrown, or marginalized. If historical patterns tell us how independent leaders were removed, the situation surrounding Ibrahim Traoré reveals why many observers believe he has become a particularly difficult target. Since taking power in 2022, Burkina Faso has remained at the center of one of Africa's most challenging security environments. Large parts of the Sahel continue to face threats from armed extremist groups, cross-border instability, and ongoing military operations. In such an environment, leadership is not merely a political position, it is also a security challenge that follows a leader every day. Over the past several years, Burkina Faso's authorities have announced the discovery of multiple alleged coup plots and destabilization attempts. Some reportedly involved military personnel, others were alleged to have links beyond the country's borders. While independent verification is not always available for every claim, the repeated announcements reveal a government operating under constant pressure and extraordinary vigilance. What makes Traoré particularly controversial is that he has positioned himself as more than a national leader. His speeches frequently focus on sovereignty, self-reliance, and the right of African nations to determine their own future. Such messages resonate far beyond Burkina Faso and have attracted attention across West Africa and beyond. Historically, leaders became vulnerable when they lost the support of key institutions or became isolated from the public. Traoré appears determined to avoid both outcomes. He regularly appears alongside soldiers, visits operational zones, and presents himself as a leader willing to share the risks faced by his country. This approach creates a powerful image. Rather than governing from a distance, he projects the image of a commander standing beside his troops during a national struggle, whether one agrees with his policies or not. This image has become a central part of his political strength. As a result, those who seek to understand his resilience must look beyond reported assassination plots and security threats. The deeper explanation may lie in how Traoré has built a connection between his personal image and a broader national cause. One of the most important reasons Ibrahim Traoré has become such a significant figure is that he does not present himself as a traditional politician. Across much of Africa, political leaders are often associated with official ceremonies, government buildings, and carefully managed public appearances. Traoré has cultivated a very different image. Again and again, he appears in military uniform rather than formal political attire. He is frequently seen visiting soldiers, inspecting military operations, and traveling to areas affected by insecurity. These appearances send a powerful message to supporters. They suggest that he is not asking others to take risks that he is unwilling to face himself. This image becomes even more powerful when viewed through Burkina Faso's history. For many citizens, Thomas Sankara remains one of the most respected figures the country has ever produced. Sankara promoted self-reliance, fought corruption, and emphasized dignity and independence for African nations. Decades after his death, his legacy continues to inspire people across the continent. Although Traoré rarely claims to be following exactly the same path, many supporters naturally compare the two men. Both are military officers. Both emerged at moments of national frustration. Both spoke about sovereignty and reducing dependence on external powers. Whether the comparison is completely fair or not, it has helped strengthen Traoré's symbolic appeal. Another factor is his age. Born in 1988, Traoré belongs to a younger generation than many African leaders. This allows him to connect with young people who increasingly shape political conversations through social media. Across countries such as Mali, Niger, Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa, his speeches and images circulate widely online. As a result, Ibrahim Traoré has become more than the president of Burkina Faso. To many supporters, he represents a broader movement centered on sovereignty, dignity, and African self-determination. This transformation from political leader to symbol may be one of the strongest reasons why attempts to weaken his position have proven far more difficult than many expected. If there is one factor that may explain why Ibrahim Traoré remains politically resilient despite constant pressure, it is the support he receives from a significant portion of the population. Throughout African history, many governments did not collapse simply because their opponents were strong. They collapsed because ordinary citizens no longer felt motivated to defend them. This reality makes public support one of the most powerful forms of political protection. A government can possess weapons, intelligence services, and military resources, but when it loses legitimacy in the eyes of its people, its foundations become vulnerable. Conversely, when large numbers of citizens believe a leader represents their interests, removing that leader becomes far more complicated. In Burkina Faso, Traoré has worked hard to maintain an image of closeness to the population. Rather than appearing distant from everyday struggles, he is often seen visiting military positions, speaking with citizens, and participating in public events. These appearances reinforce the perception that he remains connected to the concerns of ordinary people. Social media has amplified this connection dramatically. Unlike previous generations of African leaders, Traoré operates in an era where images, speeches, and public appearances can spread across the continent within hours. A speech delivered in Ouagadougou may quickly be watched in Bamako, Accra, Nairobi, Johannesburg, or Dakar. This digital environment allows his message to travel far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. The result is the emergence of a support network that is not limited to one country. Many young Africans see him as part of a broader movement advocating sovereignty, dignity, and greater control over national resources. whether one agrees with this perception or not. Its political significance is undeniable. This may be the most important lesson in understanding Traoré's durability. Security forces can protect a leader from physical threats. International partnerships can provide diplomatic support. But public belief can create a level of political protection that is often far more difficult to overcome than any security barrier. While Ibrahim Traoré's personal image plays an important role in his political resilience, the broader geopolitical environment may be equally significant. The Africa of today is not the same Africa that existed during the eras of Patrice Lumumba or Thomas Sankara. The international landscape has changed, and those changes have altered the balance of power across the continent. One of the most important developments has been the emergence of closer cooperation among Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Facing similar security challenges and political pressures, these countries have sought to coordinate their policies and strengthen regional cooperation. This has reduced the level of isolation that individual governments might have faced in previous decades. At the same time, traditional power relationships in West Africa have undergone major changes. The withdrawal of French military forces from several countries in the region marked a turning point in a system that had shaped regional security for many years. Whether one views this development positively or negatively, it has created space for new partnerships and new strategic choices. Russia has become one of the most visible new partners. Cooperation has expanded beyond security issues into areas such as education, technology, communications, and energy. Discussions involving satellite technology, infrastructure development, and long-term energy projects have reinforced the perception that Burkina Faso now has alternatives that were not available to previous generations of leaders. This does not mean Burkina Faso has become immune to external pressure. Every major international partnership comes with its own interests and expectations. However, the existence of multiple potential partners changes the political equation. A country with options is more difficult to isolate than a country with only one source of support. For this reason, understanding Traoré's survival requires looking beyond Burkina Faso itself. His position is shaped not only by domestic politics, but also by a changing international environment in which African nations increasingly seek greater freedom to choose their own strategic relationships and development paths. Despite the growing popularity of Ibrahim Traoré among many Africans, his leadership has also attracted significant criticism from Western governments, international organizations, and human rights advocates. Understanding these criticisms is essential for a balanced view of the situation. One major concern centers on democracy and political transition. Critics argue that prolonged military rule risks weakening democratic institutions and delaying a return to civilian governance. Others have expressed concerns about press freedom, political opposition, and the concentration of power within the state. Another point of criticism involves Burkina Faso's increasingly close relationship with Russia. Some Western analysts warn that replacing one foreign partner with another does not automatically guarantee genuine independence. They argue that all major powers pursue their own strategic interests, regardless of the language they use publicly. However, supporters of Traoré present a different perspective. They argue that many of the countries now criticizing Burkina Faso had decades of influence in the region, while security conditions deteriorated and economic progress remained limited for large parts of the population. From this viewpoint, calls for a new direction reflect frustration with old systems rather than blind loyalty to a new one. The reality is likely more complex than either side admits. Supporting national sovereignty does not eliminate the need for accountability, transparency, and respect for civil liberties. At the same time, criticism from abroad does not automatically invalidate the concerns and aspirations expressed by many citizens within Burkina Faso. The debate surrounding Traoré therefore extends far beyond one individual. It reflects a larger discussion about governance, independence, development, and the future direction of African nations in an increasingly competitive global environment. As we reach the end of this story, one conclusion becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. The resilience of Ibrahim Traore cannot be explained by security measures alone. It cannot be explained solely by military support, international partnerships, or political strategy. The deeper explanation lies in the powerful symbol he has become for many people both inside and outside Burkina Faso. For supporters, Traoré represents a demand for greater control over national resources, stronger sovereignty, and a future shaped by African priorities rather than external expectations. For critics, he represents unresolved questions about democracy, governance, and the risks associated with concentrating power. Both perspectives continue to shape the debate surrounding his leadership. What is undeniable, however, is that the conversation has expanded far beyond one country. Across the continent, citizens are increasingly discussing how African nations can secure their interests, diversify their partnerships, and strengthen their ability to make independent decisions in a rapidly changing world. Perhaps that is why attempts to understand Ibrahim Traoré often lead to a much larger discussion. The real question may not be whether one man can survive political pressure. The real question is whether Africa is entering a new chapter in which sovereignty, development, and self-determination are being redefined by a new generation, as movements inspired by Pan-African ideals continue to grow. Burkina Faso remains at the center of a wider conversation about Africa's new possibilities, whether viewed through the lens of Pan-Africanism, the African Union, or the influence of Captain Ibrahim Traore and Ibrahim Traore himself. The debate is far from over. If you believe these changes could shape the future of Africa, follow the channel and join us for the next analysis. For more than 10 years, the world believed the war in the Sahel was only about terrorists hiding in the desert. They told us the violence was caused by chaos, poverty, and ancient tribal divisions. But after the fall of Kidal, Mali has begun exposing something far more dangerous. The rifles were only the surface. Beneath the sand was an entire hidden system feeding the war from the shadows. Today, that system is beginning to crack. After reclaiming Kidal, the Malian army did not stop at military victory. Instead, Bamako launched a new offensive designed to suffocate the secret gold routes that kept JNIM alive for years. Suddenly, commanders disappeared, smuggling networks collapsed. Extremist clerics were arrested, and whispers about foreign-backed financial networks started spreading across the Sahel. What shocked many observers was not the speed of the military operation. It was the realization that the conflict may have lasted this long because too many powerful people benefited from instability. Some made money from gold, others gained influence through fear, and some built entire political strategies around a Sahel that never truly found peace. Now the balance is changing. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are no longer speaking like weak states waiting for rescue. They are acting like nations determined to control their borders, their resources, and their future. For the first time in decades, the Sahel is attempting to write its own rules instead of living under rules written somewhere else. If you believe Africa deserves the right to protect its own destiny, subscribe to Africa News Hub and stay with us until the end. Because the truth behind this war is darker than most people realize. The battle for Kidal was never only about territory. Long before the first armored convoy entered the desert, another war had already been raging beneath the surface. It was a war over gold. not the gold displayed in banks or traded openly on world markets, but hidden gold moving quietly through forgotten roads across northern Mali. For years, these secret routes became the financial lungs of JNIM. In remote mining zones near Gao, Menaka, and the northern desert corridors, thousands of artisanal miners worked under brutal conditions. But while ordinary workers earned almost nothing, armed networks collected taxes on every sack of ore, every truck crossing the sand, and every trader desperate enough to keep moving. The terrorists did not need to own the mines directly, they only needed control of the roads, the checkpoints, and the fear. That realization changed Mali's strategy completely. After Kidal, Bamako stopped treating the conflict as only a battlefield problem. Under the leadership of Assimi Goïta, the government launched what many observers now describe as an economic war. The target was no longer just hidden fighters in the desert. The target became the entire financial system that kept the insurgency alive. Military patrols began moving towards supply corridors instead of only chasing armed convoys. Surveillance operations focused on transport routes connected to illegal mining zones. Local intelligence networks expanded. Suddenly, traders, smugglers, and middlemen who once operated freely started disappearing from the shadows. The effect was immediate, as hidden gold routes became more dangerous. JNIM reportedly faced increasing pressure on logistics, fuel access, and recruitment payments. Mali understood a simple truth: many foreign operations failed to grasp for years. A terrorist movement can survive losses on the battlefield, but once its money begins to disappear, fear starts spreading inside the network itself. And for the first time in more than a decade, the desert economy that fed war in the Sahel was beginning to choke. As Mali tightened its grip on the gold routes, another hidden structure began collapsing in silence. The battlefield was no longer controlled only by men carrying rifles across the desert. Behind every attack was a deeper network made of transporters, informants, fuel suppliers, and ideological recruiters operating far from the front lines. For years, JNIM survived because its system was decentralized. Even when fighters were killed, new ones quickly appeared. Weapons moved through invisible corridors, stretching across borders. Fuel arrived through smuggling routes hidden inside civilian trade. Messages traveled through trusted intermediaries who rarely appeared on military intelligence reports. But after Kidal, something changed. The Malian military began combining local intelligence with surveillance operations in ways rarely seen before in the region. Instead of waiting for attacks, security forces started identifying the human infrastructure supporting the insurgency. Small logistical cells reportedly vanished, one after another. Supply vehicles disappeared along desert corridors. Informants stopped communicating. Smugglers suddenly feared crossing routes they once controlled with confidence. At the center of this pressure was a growing understanding inside Bamako that the most dangerous enemy is often not the fighter pulling the trigger. The real threat is the invisible network that allows the trigger to keep firing. Drone surveillance increased across northern corridors connecting Gao, Menaka, and remote desert zones. Local communities, exhausted by years of violence, reportedly became more willing to share information. This created an atmosphere of paranoia inside extremist networks. Trust began collapsing from within. And once fear enters a hidden organization, every silence becomes suspicious. A delayed convoy becomes betrayal. A missing commander becomes panic. A broken communication line becomes proof that someone has already talked. For years, JNIM operated like a shadow moving freely through the Sahel. But now, the shadows themselves were becoming dangerous. Mali was no longer simply fighting terrorists in the desert. It was hunting the invisible arteries that kept the entire insurgency alive. The deeper Mali pushed into the hidden networks of the Sahel, the more officials realized that the war was no longer only military. It had become a battle over faith, identity, and the minds of ordinary people. For years, extremist groups understood something many governments ignored. In large parts of the Sahel, religious leaders hold enormous influence inside local communities. A respected cleric can calm tensions, unite villages, and guide entire generations. But that same influence can also be manipulated. According to regional intelligence reports and security investigations, some extremist networks began using religious figures as logistical intermediaries. These men did not always carry weapons. Instead, they carried messages, ideology, and access. Behind sermons about faith and struggle, hidden channels allegedly helped move money, recruit young men, and maintain communication between extremist cells across borders. That realization shocked many communities. The danger was no longer only the fighter hiding in the desert. The danger could also come from respected voices trusted by ordinary families. This transformed the conflict into something far more painful. It became a battle for the soul of the Sahel itself. Recent arrests of suspected extremist-linked clerics intensified that fear. Malian authorities reportedly increased monitoring of cross-border religious movements, particularly in areas vulnerable to radical recruitment. Bamako understood that if extremist ideology continued spreading through trusted networks, military victories alone would never secure long-term stability. At the same time, the government faced a difficult challenge. Mali could not appear hostile toward religion itself because faith remains deeply rooted in daily life across the region. Instead, the state attempted to draw a line between genuine spiritual leadership and those accused of exploiting religion to protect violent networks. This is why many people inside the Sahel now describe the conflict as more than a war over territory. It is a war over truth, trust, and identity. Because once fear enters the mosque, the classroom, and the family home, the battlefield no longer ends at the edge of the desert. As Mali intensified operations across the north, another shockwave spread through West Africa. It was no longer only about military victories, it was about the collapse of an entire regional order that had dominated the Sahel for decades. For years, France positioned itself as the central security power in the region. Military bases, counter-terror operations, and political influence allowed Paris to shape much of the Sahel's security structure. ECOWAS also played a major role, presenting itself as the guardian of regional stability and democratic order. But after the rise of the Alliance of Sahel States, that balance began to fracture. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger openly challenged the old system. Instead of relying on foreign-led security frameworks, they started building their own military coordination and political alliance. To many supporters inside the Sahel, this was seen as a long-overdue declaration of sovereignty. To critics in the West, it looked dangerous and unpredictable. Western governments and media outlets increasingly described AES leaders as anti-democratic military rulers moving closer to Russia. Concerns about human rights, regional instability, and weakening democratic institutions became central parts of international criticism. Yet inside the Sahel, many ordinary citizens viewed the situation differently. For more than a decade, foreign operations promised security while violence continued spreading across villages, highways, and border regions. Entire communities lived under fear, despite years of international intervention. As frustration grew, many people stopped judging governments by speeches about democracy alone. They began judging them by one simple question: are our families safer today than they were before? That question changed everything. The governments of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are now attempting something historic. They are trying to convince Africa that security decisions do not always need to come from Paris, Brussels, or Washington. Whether the experiment succeeds or fails, one reality is already undeniable. The old order no longer controls the Sahel the way it once did. What truly transformed the Sahel after Kidal was not only military coordination, it was the emergence of a new political identity built around sovereignty, survival, and regional unity. At the center of that transformation stood the Alliance of Sahel States, better known as AES, for decades. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger were often described by international observers as weak states trapped in endless instability. Today, those same nations are attempting to build a common security structure powerful enough to resist both terrorism and foreign political pressure at the same time. Assimi Goïta became one of the central figures behind this shift. Under his leadership, Mali stopped viewing the war as only a counterterrorism operation. The government began treating it as a battle for economic control, national identity, and political independence. The strategy was clear. If extremist groups survive through gold routes, smuggling corridors, and external influence, then the state must regain control over every layer of the system. At the same time, Captain Ibrahim Traore emerged as a symbol far beyond Burkina Faso. Across Africa and among black communities around the world, many young people started viewing him as the face of a new Pan-African generation unwilling to accept permanent dependency on foreign powers. His speeches about dignity, sovereignty, and self-reliance spread rapidly across social media and political movements. Niger added another critical piece to the alliance, positioned at the crossroads of major Saharan routes. The country became strategically essential for border control, intelligence coordination, and regional security operations. Together, AES is trying to prove something that once sounded impossible, that African nations facing crisis can cooperate directly with each other instead of waiting for external solutions. The real fear for many old power structures is not simply military change. It is the possibility that the Sahel could inspire other African nations to believe they also have the right to control their own future. The most shocking discovery emerging from the Sahel today is that this war may never have survived for more than a decade without an entire hidden economy protecting it from collapse. Terrorist organizations do not survive on ideology alone. They survive on logistics, money, and silence. For years, illegal gold routes, smuggling corridors, ransom payments, and underground trade networks created a financial bloodstream flowing beneath the desert. Every convoy crossing the sand, every hidden fuel shipment, and every illegal checkpoint helped sustain a conflict that consumed entire generations. But perhaps the darkest reality is this. Many of the people benefiting from instability were nowhere near the battlefield. Some operated through black market trade. Others gained geopolitical influence from endless insecurity. And as long as the war remained profitable, peace always seemed delayed. That is why the recent actions of Mali and its allies have created so much tension far beyond Bamako. This is no longer only a military campaign. It is an attempt to dismantle an entire structure built around dependency and instability. Across Africa, people are beginning to ask dangerous questions. Who truly benefited from 10 years of war in the Sahel? Why did violence continue spreading despite massive international involvement? What is happening today is larger than Kidal and larger than Mali itself. It is part of a growing Pan-African awakening spreading across Burkina Faso, Niger, and beyond. Figures like Captain Ibrahim Traore are becoming symbols of a movement demanding that African resources serve African people. The African Union now faces a historic challenge. Will Africa continue operating under systems shaped during foreign domination? Or will a new generation push the continent toward true Pan-Africanism and self-determination? Africa New is no longer only an idea. Ibrahim Traore and other Sahel leaders believe sovereignty must be defended, not requested. As the sun sets across the Sahel, one truth has become impossible to hide. The people of this region are no longer asking permission to control their future. They have decided to claim it themselves. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, subscribe to Africa News Hub and stand with the voices fighting to keep African dignity alive. When the first explosions hit near the Algerian border, most of the world assumed Mali was simply carrying out another counter-terrorism strike deep in the Sahara. Another desert operation, another militant camp destroyed, another forgotten conflict buried beneath the headlines of bigger global wars. But something far more dangerous has started to emerge from the smoke rising over northern Mali. Because the targets being hit near Tessalit and Kidal are no longer revealing only weapons caches and fuel depots. They are exposing traces of something larger, something international, something that stretches far beyond Mali itself. Reports of FP5 reported drones similar to those used on the Ukrainian battlefield, allegations of cross-border logistical pipelines running through the Sahara, suspected financial networks linked to broader regional conflicts involving Sudan and the Gulf. Suddenly, this war no longer looks like a local insurgency isolated in the desert. It looks increasingly like a proxy battlefield, and that changes everything. For Bamako, this is no longer simply a fight against armed groups hiding in the dunes. The Malian government now presents the conflict as a struggle for African sovereignty itself, a test of whether African states can control their own security, borders, and political future without foreign powers shaping the battlefield from behind the curtain. If you want to understand where Africa's future battles are really being fought, stay with us until the end. Because what is happening in Mali today may redefine the future of the entire Sahel. For years, the outside world viewed northern Mali through a very narrow lens. Terrorists in the desert, smugglers crossing the Sahara, armed groups fighting over forgotten territory far away from the global centers of power. But inside Bamako, the perception has changed completely. Today, Mali no longer sees the conflict in the north as a simple insurgency. The government of Assimi Goïta increasingly frames it as a foreign-backed destabilization campaign designed to keep the Sahel permanently weak, divided, and dependent. That shift became unmistakable after Mali officially terminated the Algiers Accord in January 2024. For nearly a decade, the agreement had been presented internationally as the framework for peace between Bamako and northern armed groups. But Malian authorities argued the accord had failed. Instead of creating stability, they believed it allowed militant networks to regroup, expand logistical routes, and maintain de facto control over strategic territory. And the geography matters enormously. Places like Kidal, Tessalit, Aguelok, and Gao are not just remote desert towns. They sit along critical corridors connecting Algeria, Niger, Libya, and the deeper Sahara. Whoever controls these routes controls fuel movement, weapons access, smuggling networks, and military mobility across the region. That is why the recent airstrikes near the Algerian border carry such heavy political meaning. For Bamako, striking northern positions is no longer only about eliminating militants. It is about proving that no external sanctuary, no logistical corridor, and no foreign-backed network can remain beyond the reach of the Malian state. This is also where Assimi Goïta's doctrine becomes central. His government argues that sovereignty means very little if a nation cannot secure its own borders or define its own security strategy. Mali no longer wants to be seen as a country waiting for rescue. It wants to be seen as a country fighting to reclaim control of its own destiny. The transformation of the conflict becomes even clearer when looking at the evolving relationship between the FLA and extremist groups operating across the Sahel. For many years, Tuareg armed movements in northern Mali were often presented internationally as local separatist organizations with political grievances rooted in history, identity, and marginalization, and to some extent, those grievances were real. Northern Mali has experienced decades of instability, rebellion, and mistrust toward the central government in Bamako. But the battlefield realities of recent years have changed the equation dramatically. Malian officials now argue that the modern FLA is no longer functioning as an isolated local movement. Instead, Bamako increasingly portrays it as part of a broader operational network connected to jihadist factions, cross-border smugglers, and foreign logistical pipelines spreading across the Sahara. The concern is not only ideological cooperation, it is operational coordination. In several recent offensives near Tessalit and surrounding areas, armed groups appeared capable of sharing routes, fuel supplies, staging areas, and battlefield pressure at the same time. Fuel depots destroyed during Malian airstrikes revealed how essential these logistical hubs had become for sustaining mobility across northern Mali's vast desert terrain. And in the Sahara, logistics mean survival. Without fuel, technical vehicles cannot move. Without supply corridors, drones cannot launch. Without desert routes, armed groups lose the ability to disappear across borders before counterattacks arrive. This is why Bamako increasingly treats the conflict less like a traditional rebellion and more like a networked insurgency supported by regional infrastructure. For the Malian government, the war is no longer only about fighters carrying rifles in the dunes. It is about dismantling the systems keeping those fighters alive. And in modern conflicts, no armed movement survives for long without access to money, transportation, intelligence, and external support operating somewhere behind the front line. One of the most alarming developments in the Mali conflict is the growing appearance of drone warfare tactics that closely resemble patterns first seen on the battlefields of Eastern Europe. For years, wars in the Sahel were dominated by ambushes, roadside explosives, pickup truck raids, and lightly armed insurgent columns moving through the desert. But that battlefield is changing rapidly. Now, small FPV drones, precision aerial surveillance, and highly coordinated strike footage are becoming part of the conflict. And that has raised difficult questions. Several reports and public statements have fueled speculation that armed groups in northern Mali may have received external technical knowledge linked to the Ukrainian battlefield experience. Certain tactics, including low-cost explosive drones and real-time battlefield recording, began appearing in ways rarely seen before in the Sahel. Ukraine has denied directly supplying drones to armed groups in Mali. That denial is important and should be acknowledged. No public evidence has fully proven direct state transfers of weapons. But even without definitive proof, one reality remains undeniable. The methods of war in Mali are evolving. Drone warfare changes conflicts in ways that go far beyond physical destruction. A single drone strike can generate psychological fear, online propaganda, recruitment material, and international media attention within minutes. Every recorded explosion becomes a narrative weapon. This is why footage from northern Mali spreads so quickly across social media after every major attack or airstrike. The battlefield is no longer controlled only by whoever holds territory. It is increasingly shaped by whoever controls the image of the war. And for Mali, that creates an entirely new challenge. The country is no longer fighting only armed groups moving across the Sahara with rifles and machine guns. It is now confronting a conflict where technology, information warfare, and international influence intersect in dangerous ways. The Sahel may still look like a remote desert from the outside, but the methods now appearing inside this war belong to a far more modern and globalized battlefield. As the war expands across the Sahel, another layer of the conflict has started attracting growing international attention. The movement of money, weapons, mercenaries, and resources through the Sahara is beginning to connect crises that once appeared completely separate. Sudan, Chad, Libya, northern Mali. What once looked like isolated conflicts are now increasingly viewed as overlapping security corridors stretching across the heart of Africa. One of the biggest concerns centers around the regional destabilization created by the war in Sudan. Since the conflict between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces escalated, accusations involving foreign funding networks, illicit gold routes, and cross-border arms transfers have spread throughout the region. Several international organizations and investigative reports have raised concerns about external actors fueling armed networks connected to the Sudan conflict. Some analysts fear that these same smuggling routes and logistical pipelines moving through Chad and Libya could eventually strengthen militant operations deeper inside the Sahel. That does not mean there is definitive public proof that foreign governments directly fund armed groups in Mali. Such claims remain heavily disputed and politically sensitive. But the larger pattern is becoming harder to ignore. The Sahara is no longer simply a desert separating nations. It is becoming a massive transit corridor linking wars together. Fuel trafficking, illegal mining, smuggling routes, armed escorts, mercenary flows. These systems allow instability to move across borders faster than governments can contain it. For Mali, this changes the meaning of the conflict entirely. Bamako increasingly believes the country is not facing only local insurgents hiding in remote areas. It believes it is confronting interconnected regional networks capable of drawing resources from multiple crises at once. And that is what makes this war so dangerous. Because when separate conflicts begin feeding each other across borders, the result is no longer a national security crisis. It becomes a continental one. The emergence of the Alliance of Sahel States, commonly known as the AES, has transformed the Mali conflict into something far larger than a national war. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are no longer presenting themselves as isolated governments fighting separate insurgencies. They are increasingly presenting themselves as a regional bloc defending a shared political vision. At the center of that vision is one idea: African security must eventually be controlled by Africans themselves. That philosophy explains why leaders like Assimi Goïta, Captain Ibrahim Traore, and Abdourahmane Tiani continue pushing for deeper military coordination across the Sahel. Joint operations, intelligence sharing, border surveillance, and regional force integration are no longer theoretical discussions. They are becoming the foundation of a new security doctrine emerging inside the region. For supporters of the AES, this is not simply about military cooperation. It is about ending decades of dependency on foreign-led security systems that many citizens believe failed to stabilize the Sahel. But this shift has also triggered strong reactions from Western governments and international observers. Critics argue that the AES governments are becoming increasingly militarized, restricting democratic processes, and replacing one form of dependency with another through closer ties with Russia and Africa Corps. Human rights organizations have also raised concerns about civilian casualties and the long-term consequences of prolonged military rule. Those criticisms cannot simply be ignored. The reality is that the war remains deeply complicated. Civilians continue to suffer. Entire communities remain displaced. And no external partnership, whether Western or Russian, automatically guarantees peace or stability. Yet Mali and its allies continue to push back against outside criticism with one central argument. No country can truly claim sovereignty if it cannot control its own security decisions. That is the deeper battle now unfolding across the Sahel. Not simply a war over territory, but a struggle over who gets to define Africa's future security model. What is happening in Mali today is no longer just a story about one country fighting militants in the desert. It is becoming a warning about the future of security, sovereignty, and foreign influence across the African continent. The explosions near the Algerian border revealed more than destroyed camps and burning vehicles. They exposed a battlefield shaped by international interests, regional rivalries, information warfare, drone technology, smuggling networks, and competing visions for Africa's future. For Mali, the message is becoming increasingly clear. Bamako believes this war is no longer simply about defeating armed groups. It is about preventing the Sahel from becoming permanently trapped inside cycles of foreign-managed instability. Whether people agree with every decision made by Mali and the AES or not, one reality cannot be ignored. The debate now unfolding across the continent is forcing difficult questions into the open. Who should control African security? Who defines peace inside African states? And how much foreign influence can a nation accept before sovereignty becomes only symbolic? From Burkina Faso to Niger, from the rise of Pan-Africanism to the speeches of Captain Ibrahim Traore and Ibrahim Traore's growing influence among African youth, a larger political movement is clearly emerging. Many citizens across the continent increasingly want an Africa new enough to defend its own interests, shape its own alliances, and challenge older systems of dependency. Even institutions like the African Union are now facing pressure to adapt to this changing political reality. The future of the Sahel may still remain uncertain, but one thing is undeniable. The struggle unfolding in Mali is rapidly becoming one of the defining Pan-African geopolitical stories of this generation. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe to the channel, share this video, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The night sky above Kidal no longer belongs to the FLA. While Emmanuel Macron was standing before cameras in Ethiopia, speaking about Africa's future and promising billions of dollars in investment, another message was being written across the skies of the Sahel in fire and smoke. Malian warplanes and Africa Corps surveillance units were hunting targets through the darkness with a precision that is now changing the entire balance of power in northern Mali. Kidal was once the city that symbolized the humiliation of Bamako. Since 2012, the name Kidal has carried the memory of rebellion, separation, and the collapse of state authority across the north. For years, armed groups treated the region as their fortress. Convoys moved through the desert with confidence. Fighters believed the Sahel belonged to them once the sun disappeared beyond the dunes. But now the night itself has become their enemy. Reports emerging from northern Mali describe a completely different atmosphere. Vehicles moving without headlights, fighters abandoning positions before dawn, supply routes under constant surveillance. The same streets where armed groups once celebrated are now filled with fear that the next explosion may come from above without warning. This is no longer a defensive war for Mali. This is becoming a hunt. And what makes this moment even more explosive is that it is unfolding while France struggles to maintain relevance across Africa. Macron speaks of partnership, diplomacy, and development. Yet on the ground in the Sahel, Mali is sending a harder message. Sovereignty is not defended with speeches. It is defended with control of territory, control of borders, and control of the skies. Now, many across Africa are asking a question that would have sounded impossible only a few years ago. Is Kidal becoming the place where the FLA begins to collapse completely? If you believe the future of the Sahel is one of the most important stories in Africa today, make sure you subscribe and follow this channel, because this conflict is no longer just about Mali. It may shape the future of the entire region. Night after night, the pressure around Kidal has continued to rise. What began as isolated strikes is now looking more like a coordinated campaign designed to break the operational backbone of the FLA across northern Mali. The strategy is simple but devastating. Do not allow the enemy to rest. Do not allow supply routes to breathe. Do not allow commanders to feel safe after sunset. According to multiple reports circulating through regional security channels, several FALA convoys have been spotted leaving positions under the cover of darkness. Witnesses described vehicles moving quickly across desert routes without lights, attempting to avoid aerial detection. In some sectors near the outskirts of Kidal, temporary camps reportedly vanished before sunrise after drones were seen overhead during the night. The psychological impact may be even more important than the physical destruction itself. For years, armed groups across the Sahel operated with confidence once night arrived. Darkness was their protection. Fighters moved weapons, fuel, and reinforcements across the desert, believing government forces could not effectively track them. But that reality appears to be changing rapidly. Malian aircraft, supported by surveillance operations linked to Africa Corps, are now forcing armed groups to think differently. Every vehicle movement risks detection. Every gathering of fighters risks becoming a target. Every radio transmission risks exposing a position. What makes this campaign dangerous for the FLA is that Kidal may slowly be turning into a closed battlefield. The same city once celebrated as a symbol of resistance is becoming harder to defend with each passing night. Supply depots are under pressure, escape corridors are narrowing, and morale reportedly continues to weaken as fighters realize the skies above them are no longer uncontested. This is why many analysts now believe the conflict has entered a new phase. Mali is no longer reacting to attacks. Mali is attempting to dominate the rhythm of the war itself. Behind the growing pressure around Kidal stands another force that is reshaping the battlefield across the Sahel: Africa Corps. To supporters of the Malian government, this partnership represents something larger than military cooperation. It represents a declaration that Bamako no longer intends to depend on the old security system once dominated by France. In recent weeks, the operational pattern around northern Mali has changed dramatically. Surveillance drones are reportedly monitoring desert corridors almost continuously. Reconnaissance teams are being deployed deeper into remote sectors once considered safe havens for armed groups. Supply movements that previously passed unnoticed through the desert are now increasingly vulnerable to detection from above. This is where the strategy becomes dangerous for the FLA. Military pressure is no longer coming from a single direction. Mali and Africa Corps appear to be building what many local observers describe as a ring of fire around key northern routes. Areas surrounding Kidal, Tessalit, Aguelhok, and nearby desert crossings are all facing heavier surveillance and repeated security operations. Even if armed groups still control parts of the terrain, their freedom of movement is shrinking. Several reports also suggest that reconnaissance units linked to armed groups have been intercepted while attempting to monitor Malian troop deployments. In some cases, temporary camps reportedly disappeared only hours after being identified from the air. Whether every report can be independently verified or not, the overall pattern is becoming difficult to ignore. The pressure is constant, the pressure is coordinated, and the pressure is exhausting the enemy. For many fighters inside the FLA network, the most dangerous realization may now be psychological. The desert no longer guarantees invisibility. The night no longer guarantees safety. Every movement carries risk. This is exactly why the conflict around Kidal feels different from earlier phases of the Sahel crisis. Mali is no longer simply trying to survive attacks. Mali is trying to systematically suffocate the operational space of armed groups across the north. As Mali intensifies its military campaign across the north, another battle is unfolding far away from the deserts of Kidal. It is the battle over influence, legitimacy, and the future political direction of Africa itself. And in this battle, Emmanuel Macron finds himself facing a continent that is changing faster than Paris expected. During his recent African tour, Macron spoke about investment, green development, and stronger partnerships with African nations. Billions of dollars were promised. Speeches were delivered about cooperation and shared futures. But while the French president stood before diplomatic audiences in Ethiopia and Kenya, the reality unfolding in the Sahel was telling a very different story. Mali was not asking for another conference. Mali was fighting for survival and sovereignty. For years, France presented itself as the security guarantor of the Sahel. French troops operated across Mali under the promise of defeating terrorism and stabilizing the region. Yet, after years of operations, much of northern Mali remained unstable. Armed groups adapted, violence spread, and public frustration inside countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger continued to grow. That frustration is now transforming into a political realignment. The alliance of Sahel states, led by Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, increasingly speaks the language of independence rather than dependence. The message coming from Bamako is simple. African nations must have the right to choose their own partners, their own security models, and their own future without external pressure. This is why the growing partnership between Mali and Russia carries such symbolic weight. To supporters of the AES governments, Russia represents an alternative to the old system dominated by France. Critics in the West see danger in that shift, but across much of the Sahel, many ordinary citizens see something else. They see governments attempting to reclaim control after years of instability. And that may be the deepest fear in Paris. Not simply losing military influence, but losing the narrative that France remains indispensable to Africa. Behind the smoke rising over Kidal lies another dangerous layer of this conflict that few leaders openly discuss. The war in northern Mali is no longer only about local armed groups. It is becoming part of a wider geopolitical struggle stretching across the entire Sahel region. One of the biggest questions now surrounds Algeria and the desert corridors near the northern border. For years, these vast areas have been nearly impossible to fully control. Smuggling routes, hidden supply trails, and remote crossings have allowed fighters, weapons, and fuel to move through the Sahara with relative secrecy. Now those same routes are under growing scrutiny. Many analysts believe that if the FLA hopes to survive sustained pressure around Kidal, it will need secure access to northern escape corridors. Reports continue to circulate that some armed elements may be attempting to move closer toward border regions where aerial monitoring becomes more difficult. Algeria officially rejects any suggestion of supporting insurgent networks. However, the deeper the conflict grows, the more attention will focus on what exactly is happening across these desert routes. At the same time, Russia is becoming increasingly central to the future balance of power in the Sahel. President Vladimir Putin views Africa as one of the most important arenas in the global struggle against Western influence. Through military cooperation, security partnerships, and Africa Corps operations, Moscow is attempting to build long-term influence in countries that no longer trust the old French security model. For Mali, this partnership is about survival and sovereignty. For Russia, it is also about geopolitics. That is why the battle around Kidal matters far beyond Mali itself. What happens in the deserts of the Sahel could influence the future alignment of multiple African states. If Mali succeeds in stabilizing the north with support from new allies, other governments across Africa may begin reconsidering who they trust for security cooperation. And that possibility is sending shockwaves through global power circles far beyond Bamako. As the war around Kidal intensifies, another battlefield is becoming just as important as the fighting on the ground: The information war across Western media, the narrative surrounding Mali has become increasingly negative. Headlines focus on civilian risks, Russian influence, military rule, and instability. Critics argue that Bamako's partnership with Russia and Africa Corps is deepening conflict rather than solving it. Some Western analysts even claim that Mali is repeating old mistakes by relying too heavily on military force. They argue that airstrikes alone cannot eliminate extremism across the Sahel. Others warn that replacing French influence with Russian influence may simply exchange one dependency for another. These criticisms are important to examine seriously, but supporters of Mali's current direction ask a different question. If the previous system truly worked, why did the Sahel remain unstable after years of French military presence? Why did violence continue spreading across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, despite international missions, foreign bases, and billions of dollars spent on security operations? This is where the debate becomes larger than Kidal itself. Across Pan-African media networks and activist circles, the conflict is increasingly framed as a struggle for African sovereignty and psychological liberation. Voices like Nathalie Yam argue that Africa cannot become truly independent while relying entirely on foreign powers to define its security, economy, culture, and political future. That message resonates strongly across the AES alliance. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are no longer speaking only about counterterrorism. They are speaking about dignity, sovereignty, and the right to rewrite African history from an African perspective. Educational reforms, regional military cooperation, and Pan-Africanism are becoming part of the same political narrative. And perhaps that is why this conflict feels so symbolic across the continent. The battle for Kidal is no longer viewed only as a military confrontation. It is becoming a test of whether African states can reclaim control over their own destiny in a world still shaped by external influence. Because, in the end, controlling territory means little if the mind itself remains dependent. The battle for Kidal is still unfolding, but one lesson is already becoming impossible to ignore across Africa. No nation can outsource its sovereignty forever. Foreign partnerships may strengthen security for a time, but every country must eventually build the ability to defend its own borders, protect its own resources, and control its own future. That is why the conflict in Mali now feels larger than a single battlefield in the desert. Across the continent, millions are watching the Sahel closely because they see something deeper unfolding. They see a region attempting to break away from decades of dependency and redefine its place in the world. The alliance of Sahel states has already changed the political language of West Africa. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger increasingly speak about sovereignty, self-determination, and regional unity instead of dependence on foreign powers. The growing influence of Pan-Africanism and the popularity of leaders like Captain Ibrahim Traore reflect a wider political awakening spreading across the continent. Kidal has become part of that symbol, not only because armed groups are under pressure, not only because the skies above northern Mali are changing, but because this conflict has become a test of whether African nations can choose their own allies and build their own security systems without outside control. The challenges remain enormous. Terrorism, poverty, instability, and political tension still threaten the region. But Africa is changing psychologically and politically. From Bamako to Ouagadougou and across the wider African Union, a new generation is questioning the old order and searching for a different future. And perhaps that is the real meaning of this moment in Kidal. The future of Africa new movements will increasingly be shaped by Africans themselves. The struggle unfolding across Mali and Burkina Faso is no longer only military. It is also about dignity, identity, and the belief that Africa can define its own destiny. If you support this Pan-African conversation, subscribe, share this video, and join the discussion below, because the story of Ibrahim Traore, the Sahel, and Africa's transformation is only beginning. Kidal is burning once again. Explosions now shake the desert skies of northern Mali as fighter jets roar above a city that has become far more than a battlefield. For Bamako, Kidal is no longer just a remote territory lost between sand and mountains. It is the symbol of Mali's sovereignty, the symbol of resistance, and perhaps the final test of whether the new Sahel alliance can survive the storm gathering around it. In recent weeks, the Malian army launched some of the heaviest airstrikes seen in years after coordinated attacks by the FLA and fighters linked to JNIM spread across northern Mali. Military convoys moved toward strategic areas, while government officials warned that the offensive would intensify. But behind the smoke of war, another accusation has become louder than ever. Bamako now openly suggests that hidden foreign interests, especially from Western powers, are helping fuel instability in the Sahel in order to weaken the military governments of the AES alliance. Whether those accusations are fully true or not, one thing is certain. Mali believes it is fighting a war for survival, not only against armed groups, but against an entire geopolitical system that many in the region believe has shaped Africa's destiny for decades. And if Kidal falls permanently out of Bamako's control, many supporters of AES fear it could shake the entire vision of a sovereign Sahel. If you follow African geopolitics and the future of the continent, subscribe to the channel because this story may shape the next chapter of Africa itself. For decades, Kidal has haunted every government in Bamako, hidden deep in the deserts of northern Mali. The city became a symbol of rebellion, separatism, and the painful limits of state authority. Every time instability exploded in the north, the name Kidal returned like an old wound that never fully healed. When Malian forces, supported by Russian Wagner fighters at the time, re-entered Kidal in 2023, many supporters of the military government celebrated it as a historic victory. For the first time in years, Bamako appeared ready to restore full national sovereignty over territory long considered beyond its reach. Images of Malian flags raised in Kidal spread across social media and Pan-African circles as proof that the Sahel could finally resist foreign pressure and internal fragmentation. But today, the city is once again surrounded by fear, airstrikes, and uncertainty. The return of violence has placed enormous pressure on Colonel Assimi Goïta and the entire AES alliance. For many Malians, losing influence in Kidal again would not simply represent a military setback. It would strike directly at the credibility of the new nationalist vision promoted by Bamako. That is why the current military response has become so aggressive. The government understands that Kidal is no ordinary battlefield. It is a political symbol tied to national pride, military legitimacy, and the future of the state itself. Supporters of the government now describe the battle for Kidal as a defining moment for Mali's future. In their eyes, if Bamako retreats now, armed groups across the Sahel may feel emboldened, and confidence in the entire AES security project could begin to collapse. What makes the current crisis even more dangerous is the growing alliance between the FLA separatist movement and fighters linked to JNIM, one of the most powerful extremist organizations operating across the Sahel. For Bamako, this is no longer viewed as a local rebellion. It is seen as the convergence of separatism, terrorism, and foreign destabilization inside Mali's borders. The coordinated attacks launched across northern and central Mali shocked many observers because of their scale and organization. Armed fighters reportedly struck several strategic areas almost simultaneously, including Kidal, Gao, Mopti, and Sévaré. Military installations, transport routes, and logistical positions were targeted with unusual precision. To many supporters of the Malian government, such operations appeared too sophisticated to be simple isolated insurgent attacks? Dinta. The FLA presents itself as a movement defending Tuareg political interests in northern Mali. JNIM, however, follows a completely different ideological path linked to extremist jihadist networks operating across West Africa. Bamako argues that when these two forces cooperate, the threat becomes exponentially more dangerous because it combines territorial fragmentation with radical armed militancy. Inside Mali, this alliance has intensified fears that the country could enter a new phase of prolonged destabilization, similar to what devastated Libya and parts of Syria. Many citizens now worry that if armed groups continue expanding across strategic regions, the conflict may spread beyond Mali and further destabilize Burkina Faso and Niger as well. For the AES alliance, this is why the battle is no longer just about reclaiming territory. It is about preventing the collapse of an entire regional security project that claims Africans can defend their own nations without depending on foreign military systems. As bombs fall over Kidal, another battle is unfolding far beyond the deserts of northern Mali. It is a battle of narratives, influence, and competing visions for Africa's future. In recent months, Bamako has increasingly accused France and certain Western powers of indirectly contributing to instability in the Sahel by tolerating or politically protecting forces hostile to the AES governments. Supporters of the Malian government argue that Western media often describe AES leaders only as military rulers or juntas, while paying far less attention to the sovereignty concerns driving public support across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. In their view, every military setback in the Sahel is quickly used to portray the AES project as a failure, while the deeper historical frustrations of the region are ignored. At the same time, critics of Bamako strongly reject the accusation that the West is secretly supporting armed groups. Western governments officially maintain that they oppose terrorism in all forms and argue that Mali's growing instability comes primarily from weak governance, limited political dialogue, and an over-reliance on military force. This is where the information war becomes extremely important. One side claims Mali is defending itself from external interference disguised as counterterrorism policy. The other side argues that the military governments are using nationalism to justify authoritarian control and silence criticism. But inside Mali, many ordinary citizens no longer trust the old security partnerships that existed before AES emerged. They point to years of foreign military operations in the Sahel that failed to stop violence from spreading across the region. Whether Bamako's accusations are fully proven or not, the government clearly believes that the battle for Kidal is connected to a much larger geopolitical struggle over who will shape the future of West Africa. So, as the conflict intensifies, Russia and the AES alliance are becoming central players in a rapidly changing geopolitical landscape across Africa. After the departure of French forces from Mali, Bamako turned increasingly toward Moscow for military assistance, intelligence cooperation, and strategic support. What was once considered impossible in the Sahel is now becoming reality. Western influence is being openly challenged by governments that claim they are reclaiming African sovereignty. The presence of Russian military advisors and Africa Corps personnel has transformed the perception of Mali's military strategy. Supporters of AES argue that unlike previous foreign partnerships, Russia provides assistance without publicly dictating political conditions to African governments. This has strengthened the image of Moscow as an alternative partner for countries frustrated with decades of dependence on former colonial powers. At the center of this political shift are figures such as Assimi Goïta and Captain Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso. Across many Pan-African circles, They are increasingly portrayed as symbols of a new generation of African leadership determined to resist external pressure and redefine the balance of power on the continent. Still, the situation remains deeply complicated. Critics argue that Russia is also pursuing its own geopolitical interests and that military cooperation alone cannot solve the deeper social and economic roots of instability in the Sahel. Violence continues across several regions despite the growing AES military alliance. But for many supporters of Mali, the battle for Kidal has become proof that Africa is entering a new era, where countries are no longer willing to accept a single global power deciding their security priorities. In this emerging order, the Sahel is becoming one of the most important geopolitical battlegrounds of the 21st century. Behind the military offensives and political speeches, ordinary Malians are paying the highest price for the crisis consuming the Sahel. Entire communities across northern and central Mali continue to live under constant fear as violence spreads between armed groups, military operations, and collapsing local economies. Thousands of families have already fled their homes while food shortages and insecurity continue to grow. For many civilians, survival has become more important than politics. Farmers struggle to reach their land, traders fear crossing dangerous roads, and transport routes connecting major towns are increasingly vulnerable to attacks. In several regions, schools and health centers operate only partially or remain completely closed because of insecurity. This is why some analysts now warn that Mali risks entering the same dangerous cycle seen in countries like Libya, Syria, and Afghanistan, where prolonged conflict slowly destroyed state institutions and created generations trapped between war and instability. Supporters of the AES governments reject those comparisons, arguing that Mali is fighting to prevent exactly that outcome. But fears of a wider regional collapse continue to grow. If violence expands further across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, the consequences could destabilize all of West Africa. Armed groups may exploit weak borders, humanitarian crises may intensify, and millions more people could face displacement. Yet, despite the suffering, many citizens still support the idea that African nations must regain control over their own security decisions. They believe dependence on outside powers has not delivered peace. The tragedy of Mali now carries a warning for the rest of Africa. A nation can lose far more than territory during a long conflict. It can lose an entire generation's hope for stability and dignity. Kidal is now more than a burning city in northern Mali. It has become a symbol of a much larger struggle unfolding across Africa. What began as a conflict between Bamako and armed groups has evolved into a battle involving sovereignty, foreign influence, information warfare, and the future direction of the Sahel itself. For supporters of the AES alliance, the message is clear. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are trying to prove that African nations can defend their own interests without remaining permanently dependent on outside military powers. That is why every explosion in Kidal now carries political meaning far beyond Mali's borders. At the same time, the crisis also exposes painful realities. National pride alone cannot rebuild destroyed communities or end decades of instability overnight. The Sahel still faces poverty, displacement, terrorism, weak infrastructure, and growing geopolitical competition between global powers. The world is now watching whether the AES project can survive this historic pressure. Some believe this alliance represents the beginning of a stronger and more independent Africa new generation. Others fear the region could become trapped in endless conflict between rival international interests. But one thing is undeniable. The conversation about African sovereignty has changed forever. From Burkina Faso to Mali, from Pan-African movements to debates inside the African Union, a new political language is emerging around Pan-Africanism, self-determination, and security independence. Figures like Captain Ibrahim Traore and Ibrahim Traore have become powerful symbols for millions of Africans searching for a different future. And as Kidal burns, Africa may once again be deciding what kind of continent it wants to become. If you believe Africa's future deserves honest discussion and deeper analysis, subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts below. The night sky above western Guinea suddenly exploded with fire as powerful Malian airstrikes destroyed multiple terrorist bases hidden deep beneath trees and isolated terrain. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Mali, the targets had been monitored for hours before fighter aircraft unleashed precise attacks that flattened camps, destroyed pickup trucks, and wiped out critical supply points used by armed groups operating across the Sahel. But many people across Africa are now asking a much bigger question. Was this only a military operation against terrorists, or was it part of a much larger battle over the future of Mali itself? Reports from the front line revealed that more than 25 fighters were eliminated in a single day. Solar energy systems, tents, motorcycles, and hidden logistics centers were also destroyed. For many supporters of the Alliance of Sahel States, known as AES, these strikes were not just tactical victories. They were proof that Mali is changing the way it fights and changing the way it defends its sovereignty. The atmosphere across the Sahel is becoming more intense every week. Mali now believes that the conflict is no longer simply about terrorism. Many voices inside the region argue that powerful foreign interests want to weaken the growing alliance between Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger before it becomes too strong to influence or control. If you want to understand what is truly happening across the Sahel and the future of African sovereignty, make sure you stay with us until the end and subscribe to the channel. The operation itself was carried out with unusual precision. Malian forces stated that the camps west of Guinea were carefully observed before any strike was launched. This was not a rushed reaction after an ambush. It was a calculated military decision designed to destroy the enemy before they could move or disappear into the desert landscape. The destruction of the 3 bases near Guinea immediately sent a strong message across the Sahel. According to the military report, at least 15 fighters were eliminated at the first site, while another group was neutralized at a second hidden position nearby. At a third location, several camouflaged pickup trucks hidden beneath large trees were destroyed before they could be moved out of the area. Military equipment, fuel supplies, tents, and solar power systems were also reduced to ashes. For years, armed groups across the Sahel survived by remaining mobile and invisible. They moved quickly across remote terrain using motorcycles and pickup trucks, often hiding inside isolated villages or dry forest areas. But this operation showed something very different. Mali was no longer waiting to be attacked first. The army tracked the targets, observed their movements, confirmed the positions, and then launched precise strikes designed to eliminate both fighters and logistics at the same time. This is important because modern insurgent warfare depends heavily on hidden support networks. A terrorist group without fuel, communication systems, transportation, and supply routes cannot survive for long in the harsh Sahel environment. Many people inside Mali are also becoming increasingly worried about infiltration and internal betrayal. The fear is not only about armed men in the desert, it is also about people blending into communities, collecting information, and pretending to support the nation while secretly helping destabilize it. That fear became even stronger after Malian authorities arrested a fake military officer in Bamako last year. The suspect was reportedly wearing military uniforms and pretending to be part of the armed forces while moving freely among civilians. For many citizens, the case was a reminder that the battle for Mali is no longer confined to distant front lines. The conflict has entered everyday life itself. As the smoke cleared over western Guinea, the government in Bamako began framing the operation in a much larger way. Officials and military supporters argued that Mali was no longer fighting a simple counterterrorism campaign. In their eyes, the country is now defending its sovereignty against a broader network of foreign influence, destabilization, and geopolitical pressure. Across the Sahel, many voices have accused foreign actors of secretly supporting armed groups in order to weaken the growing alliance of Sahel states. Some regional commentators claim that France and other Western powers are unhappy with the rapid rise of AES cooperation between Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Others have even alleged that Ukraine has indirectly supported anti-Bamako elements operating in the region. These accusations remain controversial, and Western governments have either denied involvement or refused to confirm such claims. Still, the suspicions continue to spread across African media and Pan-African platforms. For many Malians, the issue is deeply emotional. They remember years of foreign military presence that failed to bring lasting peace. Despite major international operations, terrorism expanded across large parts of the Sahel. Villages were abandoned, and insecurity continued to grow. That history has created frustration and mistrust among many ordinary citizens. This is why the strikes near Djenné are being viewed by supporters of the government as more than a military success. They see them as a declaration that Mali intends to defend itself on its own terms. At the same time, critics in the West warn that increasing militarization and regional tensions could create even greater instability in the future. But supporters of Bamako respond with a simple argument. If the old system failed to protect Mali, then Mali has the right to choose a different path. The battle unfolding in the Sahel is therefore no longer only about territory. It is also a battle over who will shape the future of Africa's security and political independence. For many supporters of Mali's current leadership, the transformation of the armed forces is closely connected to the rise of Assimi Goïta. Since taking power during the political transition, Goïta has presented himself as a leader determined to restore national sovereignty and rebuild the authority of the state after years of insecurity and political instability. His message has been repeated constantly across Mali. No foreign country, no foreign army, and no outside power should decide the future of the Malian people. That message has resonated strongly among citizens who spent years watching violence spread despite large international military operations across the Sahel. Under Goïta, the Malian army has adopted a more aggressive posture, instead of remaining defensive and reacting after attacks occur. FAMA increasingly focuses on surveillance, rapid response, and preemptive strikes against armed groups before they can organize major operations. The strikes west of Djenné perfectly reflected this strategy. The targets were observed, confirmed, and destroyed before they could relocate or launch attacks of their own. Supporters of the transitional government now describe these operations as proof that Mali is regaining control over its territory. They argue that the country is finally acting independently, rather than relying entirely on foreign military structures that failed to eliminate terrorism over the past decade. At the same time, critics outside Mali continue to question the direction of the country and warn about rising tensions with Western governments. Yet inside the Sahel, many citizens increasingly view leaders like Assimi Goïta as symbols of resistance against dependency and external pressure. For these supporters, every successful operation carried out by FAMA represents more than a battlefield victory. It represents dignity, national pride, and the belief that Mali can defend itself with its own strength and its own decisions. The growing military cooperation between Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger is now becoming one of the most important political developments in modern Sahel history. Together, the three countries created the Alliance of Sahel States, known as IES, with the goal of defending their territories, coordinating intelligence, and reducing dependence on foreign military powers. For many Africans, the alliance represents far more than a security pact. It represents a new political mindset spreading across the continent. The message behind AES is simple but powerful. African nations should have the right to protect their borders, choose their allies, and control their own strategic future without constant outside interference. The airstrikes near Djenné are now being viewed through that larger lens. Supporters of AES argue that Mali is not fighting alone anymore. Every military success achieved by FAMA sends a signal to the entire region that cooperation among Sahel states is beginning to produce real results on the battlefield. This growing movement has also been strengthened by rising Pan-African sentiment across social media and independent African media platforms. Many young Africans and older generations alike now openly discuss sovereignty, economic independence, and the long history of foreign influence on the continent. Leaders such as Captain Ibrahim Traore in Burkina Faso have become symbols of this wider political awakening. Across the Sahel, many supporters see Traoré, Assimi Goïta, and the AES alliance as part of a larger struggle for African dignity and self-determination. For that reason, Djenné is no longer viewed simply as a location where terrorists were targeted. It has become part of a much larger narrative about whether African nations can finally build their own security systems, defend their own interests, and shape their own future without waiting for permission from outside powers. The events unfolding near Djenné carry lessons that reach far beyond the borders of Mali. Across Africa, many governments are now watching the Sahel carefully because the crisis has exposed one painful reality. A nation that cannot fully protect its sovereignty can quickly become a battlefield for outside interests, armed networks, and geopolitical competition. For decades, many African countries depended heavily on foreign military partnerships for security. In some places, those partnerships helped stabilize governments for a period of time. But in the Sahel, many citizens eventually began asking difficult questions. If foreign operations lasted for years and terrorism still expanded, then what was truly changing on the ground? This growing frustration is one reason why support for sovereignty-based movements has increased across the region. Mali's current leadership argues that security decisions must first serve the interests of the Malian people rather than external political agendas, whether one agrees or disagrees with Bamako's strategy. The debate itself is reshaping political conversations across Africa. The crisis has also shown that modern warfare is no longer fought only with guns and bombs. Information, infiltration, propaganda, economic pressure, and social division now play major roles in destabilizing nations. A country can lose control long before its capital city falls. Fear, distrust, and internal division can slowly weaken society from within. This is why many people in Mali now emphasize the importance of national unity and public vigilance. The arrest of individuals pretending to be soldiers deeply shocked many communities because it revealed how modern conflicts can hide behind ordinary appearances. For other African nations, the lesson may be clear. Military strength alone is not enough. A country also needs public trust, regional cooperation, strong institutions, and a population that believes in defending its sovereignty together. The strikes near Djenné may eventually be remembered as more than a battlefield operation. They may represent a moment when many Africans began asking whether the continent's future should finally be decided by Africans themselves. The airstrikes west of Djenné may have destroyed terrorist bases, but for many people across the Sahel, the meaning of those explosions reaches much further than one battlefield. They represent a turning point in the struggle over sovereignty, security, and the future direction of Africa itself. Supporters of Mali's current path believe the country is sending a clear message to the world. Mali no longer wants to remain dependent on foreign powers to secure its territory or define its political future. Instead, the nation is attempting to build its own strategy alongside its partners in Burkina Faso and Niger through the alliance of Sahel states. At the same time, critics continue to warn that rising geopolitical tensions could deepen instability across the region. The debate surrounding Mali therefore remains intense and deeply emotional, both inside Africa and abroad. But regardless of political opinion, one fact is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The people of the Sahel are demanding a greater voice in determining their own future. Across Pan-African movements, many now see Mali, Burkina Faso, and leaders such as Captain Ibrahim Traore and Assimi Goïta as symbols of a broader African awakening. From Bamako to Ouagadougou, conversations about Pan-Africanism, sovereignty, and the role of the African Union are growing louder every day. Many citizens believe Africa New cannot be built through dependency alone, but through unity, self-determination, and stronger regional cooperation. If you believe Africa must stand strong, protect its sovereignty, and write its own future, subscribe and join our growing Pan-African family. Thank you for watching, and we will continue bringing you the latest updates from Mali, Burkina Faso, and across the changing landscape of the Sahel. What if the biggest political shockwave in Africa this week did not come from a coup, a military operation, or a terrorist attack, but from a single sentence spoken by Emmanuel Macron? During the Africa Forward Summit in Kenya, the French president stunned audiences across the continent when he declared that France and its allies were the real Pan-Africanists. Within hours, social media across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger exploded with anger. For many Africans, especially in the Sahel, the statement felt unbelievable. A former colonial power was now claiming ownership of an ideology historically linked to anti-colonial resistance and African liberation. The timing made the controversy even bigger. France was recently pushed out of major parts of the Sahel after years of military presence, rising anti-French protests, and growing support for the alliance of Sahel states. Now many people believe Paris is trying to return through diplomacy, media influence, cultural partnerships, and a new political narrative designed to repair its image across Africa. Supporters of Macron argue that France has changed and now wants a balanced partnership with African nations. Critics say this is simply old influence wearing a modern face. But one question is now dividing the continent. Who truly represents the future of Africa? Is it the traditional Western powers speaking about partnership and democracy, or the new generation of African leaders calling for sovereignty, self-reliance, and complete independence from foreign control? Stay with me until the end, because this story is bigger than France, bigger than Macron, and even bigger than the Sahel itself. It may determine the future direction of Africa for decades to come. And if you enjoy serious discussions about Africa's changing geopolitical future, make sure you subscribe and join this growing community. The controversy surrounding Emmanuel Macron's statement did not begin with a random misunderstanding. It exploded because millions of Africans immediately connected his words to a painful history that still shapes the Sahel today. At the Africa Forward Summit in Nairobi, Macron declared that France believed in Africa as one united continent, and then made the statement that shocked many observers. He said France and its partners were the real Pan-Africanists. Almost immediately, reactions spread across social media platforms in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Many users accuse the French president of trying to rewrite history at a moment when French influence in the region was collapsing. For many Africans, Pan-Africanism is not simply a political slogan. It is deeply connected to anti-colonial struggle, African sovereignty, and resistance against foreign domination. The ideology is associated with historical figures like Kwame Nkrumah, Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, and many others who challenged Western control over African politics and resources. That is why Macron's statement triggered such emotional reactions. Critics argued that France cannot present itself as the defender of Pan-Africanism, while many people in the Sahel still blame Paris for decades of political interference, military influence, and economic control. The outrage became even stronger because France had recently lost major influence in the region. French troops were expelled from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger after growing anti-French protests and rising nationalist sentiment. Across West Africa, many young Africans now see France as part of the old system they want to escape. Supporters of Macron defended the speech by saying France has changed and now supports African sovereignty and equal partnership. But for many people in the Sahel, the damage was already done. They did not hear a message of partnership. They heard a former colonial power trying to reclaim moral authority over Africa's future. To understand why so many people in the Sahel no longer trust France, we must go back more than a decade. For years, Paris presented itself as a security partner fighting terrorism across West Africa. French troops entered Mali in 2013 under Operation Serval, after armed extremist groups threatened to advance toward the capital. Later, the mission expanded into Operation Barkhane, one of France's largest military operations abroad. French leaders repeatedly said they were protecting regional stability and helping African governments defend their territory. France also argues that its soldiers fought and died alongside African forces and that Paris intervened only after official requests from African governments. But over time, frustration grew across the Sahel. Despite years of military operations, terrorist attacks continued spreading across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Entire villages were displaced. Insecurity worsened in several areas, and many citizens began asking a dangerous political question. If thousands of foreign troops were present for years, why did violence continue expanding? That frustration slowly transformed into anger. Massive anti-French protests erupted in Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey. French flags were burned in public demonstrations, while crowds demanded the departure of foreign troops. Social media accelerated the movement, especially among younger Africans who increasingly viewed France as part of the problem, rather than the solution. Critics also accused Paris of maintaining influence through economic systems, military agreements, and political pressure long after formal colonialism had ended. Whether every accusation was true or not became less important than the fact that millions of people believed them. Supporters of France still argue that Paris became an easy scapegoat for deeper regional problems like weak governance, poverty, corruption, and extremist violence, and to some extent, that argument has merit. But politically, perception became reality. Once ordinary citizens stopped believing France was helping the Sahel, the entire relationship began collapsing. And that collapse opened the door for a completely new political movement, now reshaping the future of West Africa. As France was losing influence across the Sahel, a completely different political image began rising across Africa. At the center of that movement stood Captain Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso. To millions of young Africans, Traoré represents far more than a military leader. He has become a symbol of resistance, sovereignty, and African self-determination. His speeches about economic independence, control of natural resources, and freedom from foreign influence spread rapidly across social media platforms. Many supporters now compare him to Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary former president of Burkina Faso, who remains one of the most respected Pan-African figures in modern African history. This is one reason Macron's statement created such a strong emotional reaction. In the eyes of many Africans, Pan-Africanism was built by leaders who fought against foreign domination, not by former colonial powers trying to reinvent themselves as partners of Africa's future. At the same time, the alliance of Sahel states, made up of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, is promoting a new version of Pan-Africanism centered on sovereignty and security. Their message is simple but powerful. African nations must control their own military policies, their own economies, and their own political future without outside interference. That message resonates strongly with younger generations across West Africa. Many feel their countries remained politically independent on paper, while still depending heavily on foreign military support, international financial systems, and external political influence. Supporters of AES believe the region is finally breaking away from that model. Critics warn that replacing one foreign partner with another could create new forms of dependency, especially with growing Russian influence in the region. But emotionally, the movement continues gaining momentum because it speaks directly to pride, frustration, and identity. This is why the battle between Macron's vision and the AES vision matters so much. It is not only about diplomacy or military alliances anymore. It is a struggle over who gets to define what Pan-Africanism truly means in the 21st century. After losing military influence across large parts of the Sahel, France appears to be changing its strategy in Africa. Instead of relying mainly on soldiers and military bases, Paris is now focusing on diplomacy, investment, culture, technology, and media influence. The Africa Forward Summit was designed to present this new image to the continent. Macron repeatedly speaks about a renewed partnership with Africa. He says France no longer wants to dominate African politics and instead wants balanced cooperation based on mutual respect and sovereignty. French officials now emphasize entrepreneurship, innovation, education, sports, and youth engagement much more than military operations. On the surface, this strategy looks very different from the past. France has reduced or transformed several military bases in Africa. Paris is also increasing investment projects and cultural partnerships in countries like Kenya, Benin, Senegal, and Côte d'Ivoire. Macron argues that Africa is the youngest and fastest-growing continent in the world, and that France wants to build a modern relationship focused on opportunity rather than control. But many people across the Sahel remain deeply skeptical. For critics, the language may have changed, but the objective remains the same. They believe France is trying to preserve influence through softer methods after losing ground militarily. Instead of direct intervention, they now see media campaigns, diplomatic summits, cultural programs, and economic partnerships becoming the new tools of influence. This explains why Macron's Pan-Africanism statement created such backlash. In the eyes of many Africans, Paris is not simply defending friendship with Africa, it is trying to rebuild legitimacy at a moment when anti-French sentiment is stronger than at any time in recent decades. Supporters of France insist this interpretation is unfair and ignores genuine efforts to reform the relationship. But trust is difficult to rebuild once populations believe they have been controlled for generations. And in today's Africa, perception can be more powerful than official diplomacy. What is happening in the Sahel today is no longer just a regional dispute between France and a few African governments. It has become part of a much larger global struggle over the future of Africa itself. Several major powers are now competing for influence across the continent. France wants to preserve its historical relationships and maintain strategic influence in West Africa. Russia has expanded its security presence by presenting itself as an alternative partner willing to support governments without political pressure. China continues increasing its economic footprint through infrastructure, mining, and development projects. Meanwhile, the United States watches carefully because the Sahel remains strategically important for counterterrorism operations and access to key resources. One of the most sensitive issues is uranium in Niger. For decades, Niger has been an important supplier of uranium used in France's nuclear energy system. That is why political instability and anti-French sentiment in Niger created serious concern in Paris. For many Africans, the uranium issue symbolizes a deeper frustration. They ask why resource-rich nations remain poor, while foreign powers benefit from their natural wealth. At the same time, there is now a massive information war taking place across Africa. Western media often describe AES governments as military regimes aligned with Russia, while many African alternative media platforms portray them as liberation movements fighting neo-colonial influence. Young Africans are increasingly turning away from traditional international media and listening instead to independent online voices. That shift is transforming the political landscape. This is why Macron's statement became so explosive. It entered an environment already filled with distrust, nationalism, geopolitical rivalry, and rising demands for African sovereignty. And so, the battle for Africa today is not only about military power or economic deals. It is about who controls the narrative, who shapes public opinion, and who convinces the next generation that they truly stand with Africa's future. Emmanuel Macron may believe France is entering a new era in Africa. His supporters argue that Paris is finally abandoning the old colonial mindset and trying to build a respectful partnership based on cooperation and development. But across large parts of the Sahel, many people are asking a very different question. If France truly changed, why is distrust toward Paris growing stronger instead of weaker? That question now sits at the center of one of the most important political transformations happening in Africa today. The alliance of Sahel states has become more than a military alliance. For many supporters, it represents a psychological break from decades of dependency and foreign influence. Leaders like Captain Ibrahim Traore have tapped into something powerful across the continent: the desire for dignity, sovereignty, and African self-determination. At the same time, the situation remains complicated. Critics warn that nationalism alone cannot solve insecurity, poverty, unemployment, or economic instability. Others fear that replacing one foreign influence with another could create a new cycle of dependency. The real lesson for African nations is not that one side is perfect and the other side is evil. The real lesson is that Africa must become strong enough to negotiate with every power while remaining controlled by none. Today, the greatest battle is no longer over military bases or political speeches. It is over who gets to shape the future identity of Africa itself. That debate is now shaking the continent from Mali to Burkina Faso, from Niger to the African Union. And whether people support Macron, support AES, or support neither side completely, one thing is certain: the age of passive Africa is ending. A new Pan-African conversation has begun, and figures like Ibrahim Traore are now standing at the center of that Africa new reality. If you enjoyed this discussion, subscribe for more deep analysis on Pan-Africanism, Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traore, and the changing future of Africa. What if the biggest political shockwave in Africa this week did not come from a coup, a military operation, or a terrorist attack, but from a single sentence spoken by Emmanuel Macron. During the Africa Forward Summit in Kenya, the French president stunned audiences across the continent when he declared that France and its allies were the real Pan-Africanists. Within hours, social media across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger exploded with anger. For many Africans, especially in the Sahel, the statement felt unbelievable. A former colonial power was now claiming ownership of an ideology historically linked to anti-colonial resistance and African liberation. The timing made the controversy even bigger. France was recently pushed out of major parts of the Sahel after years of military presence, rising anti-French protests, and growing support for the alliance of Sahel states. Now many people believe Paris is trying to return through diplomacy, media influence, cultural partnerships, and a new political narrative designed to repair its image across Africa. Supporters of Macron argue that France has changed and now wants a balanced partnership with African nations. Critics say this is simply old influence wearing a modern face. But one question is now dividing the continent. Who truly represents the future of Africa? Is it the traditional Western powers speaking about partnership and democracy, or the new generation of African leaders calling for sovereignty, self-reliance, and complete independence from foreign control? Stay with me until the end.